Well, we have finally, if you look at the structure of the book of Leviticus, where you have the chiasmic formation, where you get to the main point or the middle of the chiasmic, where on both sides you have opposites that parallel each other. Well, we're at that point. So we can literally say we're at the middle of the book of Leviticus, even though it's not numerically the middle. Tonight, even though we're going to be talking about God's judgment and ransom and purification from sin, really the underlying message of tonight's lesson is God's love and mercy. And we're going to see how this operates through our study of one of the most important days on the Jewish calendar, and that is called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And we're going to follow the same format we followed in the past, where we're going to have a study followed by discussion questions. And we're going to focus on chapter 16, and then also on part of chapter 23, verses 26 through 32 of the book of Leviticus. And it is that Leviticus chapter 23, 26, verses 26 through 32. That is the chapter in Leviticus that talks about God's commands to his people, the nation of Israel, as to what feast and events they are supposed to celebrate. And 26 through 32 is God's command for Israel to worship him and to follow the rules that he provides to them for the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. This is an important verse. So I'm going to take a moment to read it. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Also, the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you, and you shall humble yourselves," I inserted, "by fasting, and present an offering by fire to the Lord. You shall not do any work on this same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement on your behalf before the Lord your God. If there is any person who will not humble himself on this same day, he shall be cut off from his people, excluding him from the atonement made for them. If there is any person who does any work on the same day, I will destroy that person from among his people. You shall do no work on that day. It is a permanent statute throughout your generations, wherever you may be. It is to be to you a Sabbath of complete rest, and you shall humble yourselves. On the 9th day of the month at the evening, from evening to evening, you shall keep your Sabbath." Now, how many times is the word humble mentioned there? It's quite a few. I counted 9 in one translation of the scriptures. Tonight's quotations from the scriptures are from the Amplified Bible, which brings in other parallel verses from other translations that help you get the full meaning of what's being said. And I think it's very helpful to use the Amplified edition of the Bible. We make the transition from last week, where we really spent some time discussing the laws which God imposed on the Israelites to separate them from the other Gentile nations. God chose Israel to be special, to be different, to be his chosen people. These laws identified what animals were considered ritually pure and therefore edible, and those which were ritually impure, which were not edible for consumption. They also identified the bodily fluids which were considered impure following childbirth, and what was required before the birthing mother could resume normal activities. And in that, we talked about the time frames for the birth of a female child were roughly twice as long as the time frames for the birth of a male child. These laws also identified various types of contagious skin diseases, molds, fungus, and other infestations, and what was required to prevent them from spreading among the people, spreading in a household, and what was required before these people could purify themselves from these infections and these infestations so that they could rejoin the community and be restored. And finally, we looked at the laws that identified the ritual impurities which resulted from male and female discharges of bodily fluids. those chapters were chapters on impurity and how it really protected the health of the people, and it also protected them in their relationship with God so that they could be restored to a communal fellowship with God. This week, we'll study God's commands regarding the Day of Atonement, which was the only day of the year the high priest was permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies in order to make atonement for his own sin and for the sin of the nation of Israel. It's called the Day of Atonement, and we really want to draw out of here. It's a challenge because most of us, if we ask most Christians what the Day of Atonement it was all about, well, they would recall that, well, that's the day that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. And that's basically the big idea of the whole thing. But to really understand what's going on, we're going to go into understanding what the word atonement is and what God has in mind when he looks at the sacrifices that are made in atonement. And so when you read these verses on atonement, you'll have a more depth understanding of what was going on. The main message which I want you to get from tonight's lesson is really twofold. Twofold in terms of how it applied to the Israelites and how it applies to us. The Day of Atonement was considered a gift from God, who provided his people with a means of atonement so that Israel could remain in peace and fellowship with God, who in his mercy accepted the sacrifices and by doing so withheld his judgment and punishment and granted the Israelites purification or righteousness from sin. That's a mouthful, but gift from God, that God provided the means for atonement, which he would accept so he can be reconciled from his people and they could be deemed righteous. Into the New Testament, Jesus was sent, provided by God, who is in his grace accepted the sacrifice which Jesus offered on the cross in atonement for the sins of those who God chose to save from his wrath, judgment, and punishment, and which God purposed to impute righteousness or purification so that those who believe will enjoy eternal salvation and fellowship with God. It's like two sides of a coin. What was going on with Israel foreshadowed what God intended in his ultimate plan of redemption. In outline, we're going to talk the meaning and significance of Yom Kippur. We're going to talk about God's instructions to the high priest and to Israel on what to do on the Day of Atonement. We're going to talk about the messianic message in Yom Kippur, then the eschatological or prophetic message in Yom Kippur. Then we have two discussion questions and the conclusions. Well, let's get into the foundation for understanding these scriptures that we're going to review tonight about Yom Kippur, the meaning and significance of Yom Kippur. There's the word or the translation of the word Yom Kippur. The Hebrew word Yom translates as day. The Hebrew word Kippur is used whenever sacrificial atonement is being described. And so we're going to have the two contexts in scriptures that describes or they use this word Kippur. And these two concepts are necessary for us to understand what was going on this very important day in this Israel. These concepts were in two categories. One is the concept of atonement, meaning making a payment of a ransom in the form of a sacrifice on behalf of the guilty party, that's the sinner, to the Lord to avoid facing God's wrath and judgment. A ransom payment to avert punishment. The second is the concept of making a blood sacrifice for purposes of being purified from the defilement which results from sin. Escape judgment and be purified from sin. Both of these concepts need to be understood in order to appreciate what was required in order for the individual and for the nation of Israel to enable them to approach and have fellowship with God as their holy and pure King who dealt with them. Atonement, let's go into the details of atonement as ransom from God's judgment. Throughout the whole Testament, a ransom was a legal and ethical, legitimate payment which delivered a guilty party from being punished by a higher authority who held the power to execute the guilty party. So it's a relationship of a higher authority that had the power to kill you for what you've done. And a ransom was a legal and legitimate way of asking for mercy or for the higher authority to withhold the punishment of death. Now, the higher authority who held the power to execute the guilty party, there was no requirement on his part to accept the payment of ransom. You could offer it and he could say, no, take him to the gallows. The acceptance of ransom payment by the higher authority was a way of appeasing the higher authority from imposing the harsh punishment which the guilty party deserved. So here, the situation is that the guilty party, the sinner, did something and they deserve to be put to death because of it. But the ransom payment was made so that there would be no penalty of death. The higher authority's acceptance of the ransom rescued the guilty party from being executed. It saved his life and restored peace to the relationship between the higher authority and the guilty party. So once the life was saved, the relationship between the guilty party and the higher authority was reestablished. The concept of making an atonement in the form of a payment of a ransom applies to the sinner who is in danger of facing God's wrath and punishment and seeks to avert God's judgment and punishment for his sin. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now we go to the second concept that goes with the notion of atonement, and that is purification from defilement. When the word Kippur is used in the context of purification, the focus is on the necessity of cleansing the sinner from defilement, which pollutes the sinner and prevents them from being able to approach God. We are unclean. Isaiah, before the throne of God, woe to me, I'm a man of unclean lips. A sinful human being, defiled by his sin, cannot be in the presence of a holy and righteous God. So purification focuses on cleansing or purifying the sinner, while ransom focuses on averting God's wrath. Now, the atonement that we're going to talk about tonight includes both an aspect of ransom and purification. The scriptural meaning of atonement includes both of these concepts of making payment of a ransom to avert God's judgment and wrath, and the concept of purification to remove the impurity or defilement which prevents the sinner from approaching God and having fellowship with him. When we're saved, we are also purified. We are deemed righteous. Righteousness of Jesus is imputed to us. We are declared righteous. Sin then not only threatens the sinner from receiving God's wrath and therefore requires the payment and acceptance of a ransom, but it also defiles or pollutes the sinner, preventing him from being in the presence and having fellowship with God. Now, having those two concepts in mind, there's a necessity for a blood sacrifice in order for atonement to take place. In order to fulfill the requirements, a sacrificial atonement requires a sacrifice of blood which is substituted and represented the life of the sinner. The sinner deserves death. He deserves to lose his life. An atonement of blood represents the life of the sinner, but it is substituted by the sacrifice of an animal whose life is taken in substitute for the sinner. In the Old Testament, God was willing to accept the sacrifice of an animal whose life and blood was given as a substitute for the life of the guilty party. Blood was not only considered a cleansing agent which ritually purified the sinner from his sin and defilement, it also delivered the sinner from the judgment and punishment of God. The offering of a sacrificial blood offered allowed the sinner to restore the relationship between himself and God by satisfying both the requirements of making a payment of a ransom to avert punishment and to ritually purify himself. The ability for sinners to ransom and purify their lives before God by means of making a blood sacrifice was a gracious gift from God. The Lord, in his grace, provided these Old Testament sacrifices to his people so that they could be forgiven and saved from God's wrath. Remember, God was present with his people in the tent of the meeting, in the tabernacle, above the mercy seat. How does a defiled, sinful nation of people live in the presence of a holy and righteous God? God provided the means of doing that. While the Old Testament sacrifices are something which the Israelites were required to do, the sacrifices were actually given to the Israelites by God as a means of atoning for their sin. They were a gift from God who granted the sacrifices to them as an acceptable means of atonement. Now, the scriptures that put this all together, we go to Leviticus 17:11. Speaking of the blood sacrifices which God enabled the Israelites to make, God said, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life which it represents." That scripture puts it all together. Now, and God in the New Testament, likewise in his grace, provided his Son as a one-time eternal sacrifice to atone for the sin of mankind. Romans 5:8-9. But God clearly shows and proves his own love for us by the fact that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Therefore, since we have now been justified, declared free of the guilt of sin, justified, purified, by his blood, how much more certain is it that we will be saved from the wrath of God, the ransom payment to avert God's wrath and punishment for judgment. Both concepts are there. There are Old Testament concepts and there are new concepts. Just the difference is Jesus Christ is the pure sacrifice that was made to atone for our sin. And the teaching point is that sinners are not able to earn their salvation. Even though they make the gifts, they make the sacrifice, it's God who provided and accepted the sacrifices. And it was God provided this out of his grace, mercy, and love for the people he chose. Now, we're going to take a transition, jumping over what Israel did on the Day of Atonement back in the wilderness to what the Jewish people today do or think about Yom Kippur. The Jewish people today think of the two Jewish holy days. For the Israelites, the Day of Atonement was a day for the nation of Israel as a whole to be restored as a holy people to the Lord. The Day of Atonement followed the celebration of the Feast of Trumpets, which started with Rosh Hashanah on the first day and concluded with the 10th day with Yom Kippur. So you have Rosh Hashanah, and then you have the Feast of the Tabernacles, and then you have Yom Kippur. They're all related to each other. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are referred to by the Jewish community as the high holy days of their faith. Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. It is seen as a day of judgment when God evaluates an individual's deeds to determine whether he will write that person's name in the book of life for the coming year. So this 10-day period starts with God making a judgment, opening up the books of life. In Jewish tradition, they believe that God writes down every person's words, deeds, and thoughts in the books of life, which he opens and examines on Rosh Hashanah, hence the name Day of Judgment. And when we look at the Jewish tradition, 3 books are opened before God in heaven. One book is for the absolutely wicked, whose names will not be written in the book of life for the coming year. They're crossed off the list just because of the dastardly things that they are and they've done. The second book is for the perfectly righteous, whose names will be written in the book of life for the coming year. That list is going to be very small. Okay, the wicked list could be much larger. But the third book is for those whose names are not entered in either of the books. And so that's most of us. That was most of the Israelites. Can you see in what's going on in this Jewish tradition the source in the Old Testament where the Muslim faith took off? God judging the deeds and weighing the deeds and looking at the deeds in terms of whether they're in the book of life. The Muslim religion sprung from this kind of a concept. Now, after the books are open, the people have 10 days to do good deeds in order to be placed in the book of life for the coming year. So it was not a permanent placement in the book of life. It was just for the following year until the next period of 10 days when God would open up the books and day of judgment, 10 days to do good deeds, and then God's decision to enter your name in the book of life for another coming year. During Rosh Hashanah and the 10 days of repentance, these are referred to as the 10 days of awe. The Jewish people repent of their sins and do good deeds to increase their chances of being inscribed in the book of life for the following year. So if you ever want to get to a true Jewish person and get the love of his life out and get the goodness of his heart out, get him during this 10-day period. Don't try to do a business deal with him on any other part of the year. Do it on the 10 days of the period of awe. Now, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, without the tabernacle, and this is the time where the people go to the synagogue to repent of their sins with a hope that they have been forgiven by God and that their names have been written into the book of life for the coming year. See how it ties in? They start with the day of judgment, scrambling to do two good deeds, and then on Yom Kippur, going to God in the temple or in their synagogues and praying that God has forgiven them and praying that God has entered their name in the book of life for another year. Yom Kippur to the Jew today is a day of fasting. No work is to be done on that day. Many Jewish people spend the day attending services at the synagogue and praying for forgiveness of their sins. God, I sure pray I did enough good things that you're going to write my name down in the book of life for this year. I just pray that you forgive me for those things that I've done the rest of the year, but I hope I made up for it. During the afternoon service at the synagogue, the book of Jonah is read to remind the Jewish people of God's forgiveness and mercy. Immediately after the evening service, the Jewish people have a break fast. They fast during Yom Kippur. After the day is over, they break the fast and have a meal. So this is how the Yom Kippur is really understood by the Jewish people today. Now let's go back in time to what Yom Kippur meant in the wilderness and when the sacrifices were made on Yom Kippur, both for the tabernacle in the wilderness and for the temple in Jerusalem. Now, as we go into Leviticus chapter 16, verses 1 through 34, we're going to see the chapter is really divided into 4 sections. The first section, the first 10 verses, is an overview of what Aaron's duties were on that Day of Atonement. The second section, which is the meat or the larger portion of chapter 16, verses 11 through 28, describes in more detail the sacrifices and rites which Aaron was required to perform to make atonement for himself and the people and the people of Israel. In this section, God identified 3 sacrifices or rituals. First, the purification offerings. These were the purification offerings made for Aaron as the high priest and his family priests, and for the people. For the high priest, what is a purification sacrifice? A bull. For the whole people, it was a goat. In this case, there's 2 goats that were selected, but one of the goats was sacrificed for the purification offering. The other goat the next ritual that is identified in this section is the laying of hands by the high priest on the scapegoat, on the goat that was not to be sacrificed. The high priest would lay his hands on the goats and then cast the scapegoat out into the wilderness. The third ritual or sacrifice was the burnt offering on behalf of the people. So it starts with 2 purification offerings, one for the high priest and one for the people. Then it goes to the scapegoat, and then it goes to the burnt offering. That's the Day of Atonement. Now, the third section in chapter 16, verses 29 through 31, provides instructions on how the Israelites were required to observe the Day of Atonement, focusing on their need for repentant hearts, humble, repentant, asking God for forgiveness. The fourth and final section, verses 32 through 34, concludes the chapter with God's command for all future generations to celebrate the Day of Atonement annually, every year, in order to ensure that fellowship between the Lord and his people remained unbroken. So that's the general organization of chapter 16. And as I mentioned before, the Day of Atonement was the only time of the year that the high priest was permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies to present the atoning sacrifices on behalf of himself and the nation of Israel. So these instructions were those that God gave to Moses to give to Aaron. And he gave these instructions after the death of Moses' 2 sons when they approached God in an unreverent way. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother that he must not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil, the Holy of Holies, before the mercy seat which is on the ark, or he will die. For I will appear in a cloud over the mercy seat. Aaron, the high priest, shall enter the holy place in this way, with the blood of a young bull, purification offering, as a sin offering, purification, and the blood of a ram as a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen tunic, and the linen undergarments will be next to his body, and he shall be belted with a linen sash and dressed in the linen turbine. These are holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and put them on. He shall take from the congregation of Israelites at their expense 2 male goats as a sin offering and 1 ram as a burnt offering. Then Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself and make atonement for himself and his house. He shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of the meeting. Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat, the Lord being the goat that's going to be sacrificed. Then Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin or a purification offering on behalf of the people. But the goat which the lot fell on for the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement on it. It will be sent to the wilderness as a scapegoat. So, as I said, this first 10 verses is an overall instruction, a general instruction of what Aaron's supposed to do. It starts with God's warning to Aaron not to enter the holies and the holies except one time of year. Otherwise, he'll suffer the same fate that happened to his sons when they approached God with the unauthorized fire. Aaron, as a high priest, was allowed to enter the holies of holies on the Day of Atonement and on that day alone. But before Aaron could enter into the Holy of Holies, he had to wash and cleanse himself and put on the white linen garments of the high priest to show his humility. He didn't put on the ornate priestly garments that we've studied in detail. These were just plain white, pure linen, fine linen garments that he wore into the Holy of Holies. Now, before entering the Holy of Holies, Aaron was also required to burn incense on coals taken from the brazen altar and take them in a censer which he placed in the Holy of Holies to fill the room with smoke, to screen or cover the mercy seat where God appeared in his Shekinah glory. When Aaron entered the holies and holies, God was there. And the Shekinah glory was screened by the incense and the smoke that filled the Holy of Holies as Aaron prepared to make the purification sacrifices for himself and for the people of Israel. Now, the next section identifies the animals required for the sacrifices of atonement, which consisted of the bull for purification of the high priest, one of the two goats for the purification sacrifice for the nation of Israel. That's a whole congregation. The second goat as a scapegoat, and the ram to be sacrificed as a burnt offering. So these are 11 through 28 are these specific instructions on what was done during the Day of Atonement. We start with that purification offering for the high priest and his household. To make the purification offering for himself and his household, which is the other priests, Aaron slaughtered the bull. He would have the censer and enter into the Holy of Holies, and using his finger, he sprinkled the blood from the bull on the east side of the mercy seat one time, and then in front of the Ark of the Testimony 7 times. And so the words of the scripture say, Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself and make atonement for himself and for his household, the other priests, and he shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. He'll take a censer full of burning coals from the bronze altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of finely ground sweet incense and bring it inside the veil to the most holy place. He'll put the incense on the fire and the censer before the Lord, so that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is on it, the Ark of the Testimony. Otherwise, he will die. He shall take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger on the east side of the mercy seat, and in front of the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. That's the purification sacrifice for the high priest and his sons. Now, to make the purification offering for all the people, Aaron then slaughtered one of the 2 goats chosen by casting lots, and using his finger, he sprinkled its blood on the Holy of Holies in the same manner as he did for the purification offering with the blood of the bull. The verses of scripture say, then he killed the goat of the sin offering that is for the sins of the people, and bring its blood within the veil to the most holy place, and do so with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it on the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. So he shall make atonement for the holy place, the Holy of Holies, because of the uncleanliness and transgressions of the Israelites for all their sins. He will also do this for the tent of the meeting, which is among them in the midst of their uncleanliness or impurities. There shall be no person in the tent of meeting where the high priest goes to make atonement in the holy place within the veil until he comes out, so that he may make atonement for himself, his own sins, and for his household, and for all the congregation. Are you getting the picture of what's going on here? It's amazing. He is doing a purification offering to remove the defilement from sin and as atonement for sin. It's a purification that fills the requirements of ransom and purification. Then Aaron completed the purification offering by sprinkling the blood of both the bull and the slaughtered goat 7 times on the horns of the brazen altar in the courtyard on all sides. So he'd take the rest of the bull and sprinkle it on the brazen altar outside the tabernacle in the courtyard. The instructions of scripture are that he'll go out to the altar of burnt offering in the court, which is before the Lord, and make atonement for it. And it'll take some of the blood of the bull and the goat and put it on the horns of the altar on all sides. With his finger, he shall sprinkle some of the blood on the altar of burnt offering 7 times and cleanse it, purify it, and consecrate it from the uncleanliness of the Israelites. He just went through a process of purification for himself, the people, the tabernacle, and this was offered to God in God's presence. Completing that act, then the specific requirements for the scapegoat are as follows. We have the Lord's goat that's sacrificed for the Lord, and then we have the people's goat that is the scapegoat. So after completing the purification offering, Aaron performed the ritual of laying both hands on the head of the living goat to transfer all of the sins of the Israelites to the goat to carry into the wilderness. The scriptures say at verse 20, when he has finished atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat Then Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness of the sons of Israel and all their transgressions in regard to their sins. And he shall lay them on the head of the goat, the scapegoat, the sin bearer, and send it away to the wilderness by the hand of a man who is prepared for the task. The goat shall carry on itself all the Israelites' wickedness, carrying them into a solitary or infertile land, and he shall release the goat in the wilderness. Literally, a man was prepared after the ritual of laying hands and transferring symbolically and ritually all the sins of Israel on the scapegoat. This man would lead the goat out of the courtyard, through the camp, out into the wilderness, and release the goat. Now, Jewish tradition is that this goat did not survive in the wilderness. He was consumed in the wilderness as punishment for sin. But this man was prepared to do the task. We finished the second major section of the Day of Atonement. Now we get to the third section, which is the burnt offering. After completing the purification offerings and casting off the scapegoat, Aaron performed the third and final sacrifice by offering the burnt offering on behalf of the people. Before making the burnt offering, there's a transition here. Aaron bathed and changed into his ornate priestly garments. He has satisfied the requirements of atonement, satisfy the requirements of paying ransom and purification, and now he can put his priestly garments on to make the burnt offering. Remember, a burnt offering isn't a sin offering. A burnt offering is an offering where the entire animal is consumed on the fire, and it's all people made burnt offerings to petition the Lord. They made burnt offerings to give thanks to the Lord. And so we have the scriptures that say, then Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting and take off the linen garments which he put on when he went into the holy place, the Holy of Holies, and shall leave them there. He shall bathe in his body with water in a holy place and put on his clothes. We're talking about his priestly garments now, and come out and offer his burnt offering and that of the people and make atonement for himself and for the people. Now, a ram was sacrificed to make the burnt offering for Aaron and all the people. And he shall offer up this in the smoke the fat of the sin offering on the altar. Remember the purification offerings. The purification offerings, the blood was taken into the Holy of Holies and then sprinkled on the mercy seat and before the mercy seat, and then it was all the rest of the blood was sprinkled on the brazen altar outside. Well, the fat of the animal was taken and put on the burnt offering. The Lord got the best choices. What happened to the rest of the purification offerings? They were taken outside the camp and burned outside the camp. None of it was offered as a sacrifice to God. It was offered for purification, and in purification, they were taken outside the camp. So what this verse 25 is speaking of is the fat of the purification offering, not the burnt offering being burned on the altar. The burnt offering required the entire animal to be consumed by fire on the brazen altar in the courtyard. So note that there's also no grain offering that goes along with the burnt offering. This reflects that the offering for atonement had already been made and accepted by God, and that the burnt offering is expressing worship and thanksgiving for the Lord's gracious provision, forgiveness, and acceptance of the sacrificial atonement offerings made by Aaron. See how it ties together? Now, after the sacrifices on the Day of Atonement concluded with the rest of the purification sacrifices, the bull and the goat, which were sacrificed for the purification offerings on the behalf of the people, were taken outside the courtyard by that same person who took the scapegoat. But since the person that had taken the scapegoat out into the wilderness was ritually defiled by taking a sinful scapegoat bearing the sins, he had to wash and bathe himself before he came in to take the purification offerings from the courtyard out to the place outside the camp where they were consumed. So the whole thing fits together. The scriptures say the man who released the goat as the sin-bearing scapegoat shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp. The bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering Those are the two purification offerings. Whose blood was brought to make atonement for in the holy place, shall be taken outside the camp. Their skins, their meat, their waste shall be burnt in the fire. Then he who burns them shall wash his clothes and bathe his body with water, and afterward he may come back into the camp. So hopefully what we studied in terms of the offerings which God allowed, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the purification offerings, the offerings made for the high priest, the offerings made for the people, it's all tied together in the Day of Atonement. And so now you get a picture of what's the significance of a purification offering as opposed to a burnt offering, and how they meet the requirements for God's ransom payment to abate or avert God's judgment, and for purification so that people can have fellowship with God. Chapter 16 ends with the instructions to Israel. The instructions for Israel at the time, what to do on the Day of Atonement. The Israelites were given three different things regarding the Day of Atonement, which they were required to do. First, they were required to observe the Day of Atonement as an ongoing ordinance. In other words, perpetually. And they were to celebrate it on the 10th day of the 7th month, which in the Jewish calendar took place during the fall harvest months, late September, early October. Second, the Israelites were required to humble themselves. Remember that word humble from the first verses we read 9 times? And they humbled themselves by fasting and by acts of self-denial, not wearing jewelry, not wearing perfume or ointments, and displays of self-denial. Sometimes they didn't really spruce themselves up, comb their hair, just any way of self-denial. They were outward signs of the humility that they were supposed to bear in their repentant heart. Third, on the Day of Atonement, the Israelites were forbidden from doing any work and were admonished to treat the day as a holy day where they focused on their sins and impurities and spent the day in prayer and petition to the Lord. Because the temple no longer exists, the Jewish people really focus on this third requirement and how they celebrate the Day of Atonement today. Now, in the future, this atonement required them to make atonement on behalf of the nation. It was a lasting ordinance to be performed by the high priest for all future generations. We're going to conclude this or go to the messianic message that's in Yom Kippur. And we're going to repeat the two messages or the two things that I wanted you to get from this lesson. The Day of Atonement was considered a gift from God, who provided his people with a means of atonement so that Israel could remain in peace and fellowship with God, who in his mercy accepted the sacrifices and by doing so withheld his judgment and punishment and granted them purification or righteousness from their sin. Okay, and secondly, the messianic message, Jesus was sent, provided by God, who in his grace accepted the sacrifice which Jesus offered on the cross in atonement for the sins of those who God chose to save from his wrath, judgment, and punishment, and which God purposed to impute righteousness or purification so that those who believe will enjoy eternal salvation and fellowship with God. Everything with the Day of Atonement points to the eternal, acceptable sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. We're going to go to the eschatological or prophetic messages in Yom Kippur. When we talk about this, we're going back to the nation of Israel. Yom Kippur to the Jewish people will be that day, the end of times, that day when things happen, when Israel is restored to God as a nation. The ultimate restoration of Israel will take place during and as a result of the tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble, when the 144,000 Jewish evangelists will preach the gospel, the message of the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, and when, first, all Israel will look on the Messiah as the one they pierced, and that the one that they will mourn for him as one who mourns after a firstborn. Israel is going to recognize that Jesus that they killed on the cross was the Messiah. That's Zechariah 12:10. It's going to be that day when Israel will receive cleansing from sin and impurity. Zechariah 13:1. It's going to be that day when the stone which the builders, Israel, rejected will become the chief cornerstone of Israel. It'll be the foundation. Psalms 118:22. It'll be that day when Israel will lament that they were like sheep who had gone astray, with each having turned his own way, and the Lord laid upon the Messiah the iniquity of all Israel in order to redeem them. Isaiah 53:6. It'll be that day when the nation of Israel shall be born in a day, and all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26. And it will be that day when Israel will be grafted back into her own olive tree and gathered and restored to the Lord. Romans 11:23 through 25. Yom Kippur has a messianic day that is going to be realized for the nation of Israel. Now, while a great number, perhaps as many as 2/3 of the Jewish people will be perished or killed during the tribulation, the nation of Israel will ultimately recognize Jesus as their Messiah, and who will fight for and rescue Israel by destroying her enemies. Yom Kippur. And I hope that you get a chance to review it from time to time, because this is really the gospel. As holy and righteous God had to provide a means for his people to make atonement for their sins so that they can enjoy fellowship with him. The sins of God's people not only placed them under God's wrath, judgment, and punishment, but also defiled them so they could not enjoy peace and fellowship with God. The sacrifices and rituals which God provided to Israel on the Day of Atonement enabled the Israelites to pay God a ransom to save them from God's wrath, judgment, and punishment, but also purified them from the impurity and defilement caused by their sin, which prevented them from enjoying peace and fellowship with God. The sacrifices and rituals on the Day of Atonement pointed to the sacrifice which Jesus offered on the cross, a sacrifice which was unmerited, free gift from God, which God accepted as ransom from his, and there's an extra him in there, wrath, judgment, and punishment, which those who God chose deserved for their sin, and which purified those who believed so that they would be able to enjoy eternal peace and fellowship with God. So that kind of wraps it up for us.
Wow.